within just 1 year of Charles Lindbergh's flights, the number of pilots in America triples, the number of airplanes licensed in America quadruples, and within 18 months of his flight, the number of people buying commercial airline tickets in the United States went up 30-fold, and the effects on the rest of the world were similar. The welcome that Charles Lindbergh got from the flying community of St. Louis is the reason that we're able to be on the other side of the planet on the same day today. Here's a picture from 1923. This is what the airport looked like when Lindbergh first came to St. Louis for the big air races that were happening. And if you look carefully, you could see that the Jennies are outnumbered by horses. And due to the obvious dangers posed by having horses and airplanes at the same place, some believe that a system for alerting pilots of the presence of horses would be a good idea. Can you imagine if we had NOTAM H's, horse NOTAMs? In fact, some aviation historians have even suggested that inventors tried to build instruments that could sense horses. And I've heard that they were even thinking about sensing the places where you keep horses, which would have lent new meaning to the term stall warning. Personally, I believe that this proves that aviation historians drink too much. When Lindbergh was flying the airmail from St. Louis through Springfield and Peoria to Chicago, this is what the west side of the airport looked like. This is the offices of the Robertson Aircraft Company where Lindbergh flew. And somebody marked, you'll see this downstairs if you look at the exhibit, here's the boarding house that Lindbergh lived in. And this building actually survived after the airport was totally transformed later on for a bit. This is Louis' Lunch Shack, which is famous in St. Louis history. Louis had pictures on the wall. On one wall he had pictures of the pilots who had passed away, mostly by flying. And the other wall were pilots that were alive. And Lindbergh talked about how occasionally some wag would mix up the pictures, and they would go in and check to see which wall they were showing up on. But this is what it looked like just 2 years after Charles Lindbergh's flight. So aviation mushroomed. Robertson now has torn down those buildings I showed you. Here's the boarding house, it's still there. But now they've got big hangars. Here's the original terminal. And von Hoffman Aviation and Universal were big back in the day. And these buildings, some of these buildings were here until well into the 1960s. So aviation really exploded in the world because of what happened right here and because of the welcome and the support given by the aviation community to a young 25-year-old airmail pilot. And it was an incredible thing. So we're really in almost the temple of modern aviation here. Now, it's probably true that most of us pilots believe that we're in the top 1% of the total pilot population. It's a little bit like Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average. The nice thing about this delusion is it's very hard to disprove it. There's no easy, convenient way to do it. But when it comes to facts about who has flown the hottest and fastest airplane ever built, the truth is crystal clear. Only a handful of the most elite pilots in the world have ever flown Lockheed's amazing SR-71 Blackbird. And tonight's keynote speaker is a member of that ultra-elite cadre. After flying Sabre jets and F-101 Voodoo fighters, George Andre joined Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works as a senior flight test engineer. In fact, in addition to flying the Blackbird, he managed the SR-71 flight acceptance program. He went on to serve as a combat fighter pilot in Vietnam, and he's an Air War College graduate. He retired from the Air Force as a lieutenant colonel. Later at TWA, Captain Andre was an active line pilot. He was a Boeing 767 International captain, and he was a Czech airman. And after his so-called retirement in 1994, He started an aviation consultancy. He started a touring aerobatic airshow act, which is performed all across the United States, including here at Fair St. Louis. And he successfully competed in the national Formula One and sport biplane air races at Reno. George Andre's flying career could fill a book. In fact, it has. His biography, Wingspan, From J3s to Mach 3, was published in 2013. Please join me in welcoming tonight's keynote speaker, George Andre.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the SR-71, which was just an unbelievable airplane and had an unbelievable history. It's a true honor to have played a small part in the development of that airplane. I was in the Air Force, and then I was a test pilot for Lockheed on the F-104, and then I came over and got on the SR-71 program. Most of everything I'm going to talk about is from the mid-60s, from 1963 to 67. Later on, as I left the program, the Air Force got the airplane, and the Air Force flew this airplane for about 25 years and had quite a exemplary record in gathering intelligence for the U.S. government all around the world. So much has changed over the years. I'm going to open with a little short film here that mainly is a tribute to Kelly Johnson, the designer of the SR-71. It's right. It's right. Well, these first pictures are some of the construction of the airplane and some various views, and we should have a sound coming up here as soon as Phil gets it plugged in. Anyway, with an airplane like this, you really don't need sound. It is visually inspiring, to say the least.
Good cover, George. I like that.
At this point, the maker of this film is talking about what a privilege it was to be part of the Blackbird family, it's like nothing else.
Today, Kelly, you are being honored for your design work on the SR-71, and justly so. To me, the SR-71 is not only your greatest aircraft design, it is perhaps the greatest aircraft ever built. I've heard it said that you considered the Blackbird the most fascinating challenge of your career. No wonder. It was a design that was so advanced that everything that touched it had to be new. New manufacturing processes, new tools, new materials, a whole new approach. You built an operational stealth aircraft a decade before most of the world had even heard the term. It was a design so far ahead of its time that it retired before time could catch up with it. In times of crisis, the Blackbird provided 6 presidents with a unique and critical view of the world. The Blackbird served this country for just over a quarter of a century. In that entire time, it stood in a class of one. To me, the Blackbird is much more than a technical marvel. It's an airplane that gets inside you, an aircraft that causes the adrenaline to flow just by looking at it. Kelly, your Blackbird is the stuff dreams are made of. It's the model plane sitting in a young child's room, proof that everything is possible, that the sky isn't the limit. And it's the poster hanging on the office wall of a middle-aged engineer, testimony that yes, even in the real world, miracles do occur. The SR-71 embodies all that excites people about aerospace. Its crew seems part pilot, part astronaut. The Blackbird itself appears part airplane, part spacecraft.
Well, Kelly Johnson was an unbelievably aircraft designer and is certainly worth all the many awards that he's been given over the years. probably one of the most memorable moments of my life is when I went into Kelly Johnson's office and he presented me with my Mach 3 Plus membership card, number 16. This is a patch that Lockheed made up to give the SR-71 people after they had exceeded 3 times the speed of sound. These were once very, very rare, but you can now find them on eBay. We're going to talk a little bit about the historical beginnings of the SR, design features, and early days at Mach 3. Why do we have spy planes, and why is the CIA getting involved in this? Well, the nation needs intelligence data from all around the world. We certainly have a number of enemies, and the CIA is the instigator of the airplane that came before the SR-71. That was the U-2. There was a very heavy security going on with the SR-71 program because it was under the umbrella of the CIA. They scared us a lot with what penalties might be for divulging secret information. We certainly didn't have personal communications like our own email server at home. So we had to find out about Russian nuclear bomber capability, and so the U-2 was designed, and the U-2 flew over Russian territory for many, many years until May 1st, 1960, when Gary Powers was shot down. We were mainly worried about polar attacks, Russian bombers coming over the pole and bombing us. It turns out a lot of that was overblown. However, as early as 1958, the CIA and the government knew that there was probably going to have to be some kind of follow-on airplane, and so work was started on a U-2 replacement at that early date. I went too far. Okay, here's the original fleet of CIA airplanes that were built. This is called the A-12. This was built under what was called Project Oxcart. It was run by the CIA. And this is a picture taken at Area 51 out in the Nevada desert. And these are the original single-seat Blackbirds that were built. This is a forerunner of the SR-71. This airplane was a little bit lighter weight and only had a crew of 1. And it normally would fly at 3.3 Mach number and up to 90,000 feet. Here's the Blackbird family. Up in the upper left-hand corner is the original airplane, the A-12. In the upper right-hand corner is the YF-12, which was an interceptor version of the Blackbird. It was not a very good idea. They really did need a Mach 3 interceptor, and that program was eventually canceled. In the lower left-hand corner is the M21D21. Now that's an A-12 that's been modified to carry a drone on the back of it. They would fly that combination in toward denied territory at Mach 3, launch the drone, and the drone would take off and fly at Mach 4 or Mach 5 speeds, go in over enemy territory, take its pictures, turn around and come back out, would parachute out the data package, and then the drone would be destroyed. On the fourth flight that they flew, making an actual launch, the drone hit the mothership, put it out of control, and both pilots had to eject. And this is out over the Pacific Ocean, and one of the guys in the airplane, his pressure suit was torn on ejection, and when he went into water, it filled with water, and he drowned. So with that tragedy, Kelly Johnson just canceled that whole program and says, let's not do that. Lower right-hand corner is the final follow-on airplane, the SR-71. We built 31 of those, and none of them were ever lost to any kind of enemy action. Almost everything on this airplane has to be invented from scratch because nothing off the shelf in aviation is workable at Mach 3 and at altitudes of around 85,000 feet. So the starter had to be invented, a new kind of ignition system. We had to inert the fuel tanks. construction materials were totally different from contemporary airplanes at that time. The airplane had to be stealthy, couldn't be picked up on active enemy radar, and we had a very unique drag chute. And we will cover each of those items in a little fuller. The airplane, all of this dark area is fuel tank, and the airplane carries 80,000 pounds of fuel. The total airplane has a max gross weight of 140,000 feet. Back on the back of the wings are elevons. They act as elevators for pitch, and they act differentially as ailerons for roll control. And then we have the two rudders. Up in the nose section is an area that we can swap that nose out in very rapidly, and depending on what the mission was, what you're going to try to find out in the way of intelligence, you could swap the nose, put in a nose with different kind of cameras and so on. Along the side of the fuselage is a triangle sharp-edged area called the chine, and within the chine is where all the cameras and the different kind of sensors were located. It's a two-man crew, has this giant J58 engine, which we'll talk about. So to develop a new kind of starter for this airplane, typical electrical or combustion starter in an airplane of that era would not work in this airplane. So we had a mechanical starter. We had a start unit down here that had two giant Buick engines in it, and that drove a shaft that went out the top of that into the bottom of the nacelle that was directly geared to the engine. And they would start running those Buick engines. They'd run at 7,000 RPM, and they had straight pipes, and they were the loudest thing in the Mojave Desert. So they would start the engine that way, and then the shaft would retract out, and the pilot could go on his way. Ignition system had to be totally developed, and so this airplane has a chemical ignition system. It is a pyrophoric compound, which is a name for a compound that when it gets injected into the atmosphere, it immediately bursts into flames. They use a compound like that to often ignite liquid fuel intercontinental ballistic missiles. So we had to have a special fuel in this airplane. It's called JP7. It's very low volatility, and if JP7 leaks out on the ground, you could throw a match in it and it would not ignite. It had a very high flash point, and we needed that because of the heat that the airplane generated at Mach 3. So this pyrophoric compound was, its chemical name is triethylborate, which we call TEB, and we use a shot of TEB for lighting the engine off initially, and every time we lit the afterburner, we had to use a shot of TEB. So it's a very reliable system and worked very well. The airplane gets very, very hot due to skin friction going over the surface of the airplane. You could easily fry an egg on the surface of this airplane. The skin averages about 400 to 600 degrees Fahrenheit when it's up at Mach 3. And back around the tailpipe, the temperatures can be as high as 1200. If you have an electric stove at home, the burner on your stove is about 300 to 500 degrees. So you can compare that with what the skin on this airplane would be like. After you've had an extended flight at Mach 3 and the airplane has really gotten warmed up, after landing, big heavy parts of the airplane like the landing gear strut and things like that, you can't put your hand on it because it's still too hot. Well, we got two guys flying in this airplane, and we got to protect them from all this heat, and so we had a cockpit air conditioner that was equal to a 5-story office building. It worked very well, and on one flight I had, it went full cold, and everything in the cockpit froze. We have a neck ring on our pressure suit, and moisture in the ring froze, and I couldn't even turn my head left and right because of the frozen conditions. So we have to keep this safe because of the high temperature. And so another unique system we had on the airplane was fuel tank inerting. We would carry liquid nitrogen in this airplane. We had 3 big bottles of liquid nitrogen, and that has to be kept something like 250 degrees below zero to keep it in a liquid state. That would get converted to gas and be pumped into the fuel tank. As the fuel level goes down in the tank, you got this area above that's empty, and fuel fumes gather in there, and that's very, very explosive. So we pump in nitrogen to vent that fuel tank area and keep it safe. Now, if you remember TW-800, the 747 that took off at Kennedy Airport and blew up, that was supposedly because fuel fumes in the center tank were ignited by a spark for some reason. So anyway, I wish TW-800 would have had an inerting system like that. But that's just another thing that has to be developed for this airplane that has never been needed in aviation before. To handle all of that temperature, normally a metal airplane would be made out of aluminum, and aluminum is much too soft and cannot take the heat. Going to steel would be way too heavy, so they have a metal in between as titanium. And 93% of the weight of the metal parts of the airplane is made out of titanium, as is much of the engine. Titanium is brings with a lot of problems because it's a very hard metal to work with. It's very hard to drill, it's very hard to machine, and so new construction methods had to be developed to handle and build an airplane out of titanium. And because titanium is relatively heavy, the airplane is relatively flimsy, where you might think an airplane like this would be pretty strong. It's generally fairly weak in the vertical mode. We never pulled more than about 2 Gs, which is like a 60-degree bank turn. The airplane is totally non-aerobatic, so skin thicknesses and things like that are fairly thin, and you can see sometimes you see a lot of ripples in the skin and everything. Titanium is very prone to corrosion. If you were to write on a piece of titanium with a Pentel pen, it will immediately start eating into the metal. We found out that they were getting a lot of corrosion in the metal parts in the summertime, and they found out that the city of Burbank would add chlorine to the water for everybody's swimming pool out there in Southern California. The chlorine was when you would wash the airplane with Burbank water in the summertime, it would start corroding. So Lockheed had to build their own water purification plant and everything else to make water to use in building the airplane. Almost everybody's tools in your toolbox, your wrenches, everything else, are cadmium plated. You cannot use cadmium tools on a titanium structure. It will immediately start corroding the metal. The thermal effects on this airplane, the airplane grows 1 feet in length when it gets hot from high speed. So a lot of the joints in the big fuel tank running the entire length of the airplane are built with gaps in them, so that when the airplane expands in flight, the gaps join together, and that's what seals those fuel tanks. So there's always been a lot of talk about the SR-71 that it leaks fuel on the ground, which is shown in a lot of pictures. That is because the fuel is leaking out of those expansion joints that are intentionally built with a lot of gap in them, so that at the high speed it will fill up. The top and the bottom surface of the wings are corrugated like the skin on a Ford Trimotor. That's because as the wing expands from the heat, those corrugations will handle the extension of the growth of the skin on the wing. And a lot of the airplane is built with composites, a material like fiberglass or carbon fiber, but they basically are using a lot of composites for stealth reasons, because composite structure will not reflect back radar energy like a metal surface would. So to make it stealthy, one of the reasons is that's why it's black, and one of the reasons, a big reason it's black is because black has a greater rate of emissivity. The airplane is building up heat from the high speed and the friction, so the black airplane will give off the heat a lot faster than a lighter airplane. If you're worried about solar radiation or something like that, you would paint the airplane white, but we want to get rid of that heat. And within the paint is tiny microscopic iron spheres that are suspended in the paint, and it's almost like dust, and that helps the paint on the airplane absorb radar energy. That makes it more stealthy. The materials I mentioned about composites, they soak up radar energy better. We had all of our radar antennas, like the UHF radio, the HF radio, we had TACAN, transponder antennas all retract into the airplane so that they don't create a radar reflection. The exhaust plume coming out the back of the engine is also can be picked up by radar and has a element of reflectivity to it. So when they fly an operational mission over dangerous territory, they add a chemical to it. It's called cesium. It's a special compound, and that's to make the exhaust plume coming out the engine not so reflective. The leading and trailing edges of the wings are sawtooth notch like that, and they have composite pieces that are put in there, and they do not reflect the radar very well. Both rudders are solid composite construction. They're also sloped inward for two reasons. One is it has some more stability to the airplane, and the other is they don't reflect the radar as badly. The spikes in the inlets are also composite construction. As far as drag chutes go, this has the mother of all drag chutes. We have a 3-stage drag chute, a small pilot chute that pulls out a larger extraction chute, and that pulls out the main parachute, which is a 40-foot diameter drag chute. When I first started going on the airplane, the main chute was 50 feet. So to deploy the drag chute, there's a T-handle that comes out of the top of the instrument panel. So you would grab this T-handle, you pull it back about 3 inches, and that would deploy the drag chute. To jettison the drag chute, you push the handle back in. Well, they learned that when you pull that drag chute and it deploys, the deceleration force as the drag chute inflates is such that if you're still holding on to that drag chute handle, you will invariably push it back in and jettison the drag chute. So that wasn't something you wanted to do. So the technique got to be you pull the drag chute and get your hand off of the handle. If you were if you were driving a Formula One race car, the very top newest Formula One race car today, and you were going 160 knots, which is about our touchdown speed, and you slammed on the brakes as hard as you could not equal the deceleration rate of about 1 G of what this is when the drag chute deploys. So the crew needs to be very cognizant of having your shoulder harness locked when you land and when you pull the drag chute, because surely you will plant your face on the instrument panel. Now, it's not as bad as a carrier landing with an arresting hook, but it is pretty significant. Here's a picture of the driver's seat. It's rather old-fashioned because this airplane started design in 1958, and these were built around 1960 to 63. So there's no glass cockpit because glass cockpits hadn't been invented yet. The checklist that the pilot it carries is about 2 inches thick. It's got all kinds of procedures in there to handle all these problems that might occur at high speed and high altitude. To have something like an iPad along would be an unbelievable luxury for the crew. On the top of the stick is a typical trim switch like most fighter airplanes have. You push it 4 1/2 for pitch trim, and you would push it left and right for roll trim. In this case, on the SR, the left and right motion of that switch is for rudder trim. Because of the vast asymmetric thrust you can have with these big engines, if you lose an engine, you want to trim the rudder right away, and that's the quickest way to get to it. Our roll trim was a little switch on the side console that was spring-loaded left and right, and that was our roll trim. But that normally wasn't nearly as critical as the directional trim, so they put that on the stick. How do we navigate? There's a saying going around among Blackbird people that you haven't been lost till you've been lost at Mach 3. You're going 30 miles a minute. That's a half mile every second. So if you're lost and you don't know where you are, you're getting loster and loster every second. And so this astro-inertial navigation system is a window on top of the airplane behind the cockpit. And there's a little telescope in this unit that looks out. Every 20 seconds it looks for a different star. So it's constantly 3 times a minute changing stars and measuring the angles to these different stars. It's looking at the star frequency, not the actual light of it, but the frequency that the star is putting out. Within the box there, they have this huge star almanac that has the knowledge of where all the stars are and what their frequencies would be. So this is constantly triangulating its position from 3 stars a minute, finding the position of the airplane, exact position in space. And then that data runs down to a standard inertial nav system and a navigation display for the pilot to use. This system was built by Northrop Aircraft. It absolutely never failed. It was really a good unit, and it's very impressive how accurate it would be. It would take upwards about an hour to get it all stabilized and ready to go for a flight, and the routing that a person would go on an operational mission would be pre-programmed into our autopilot and our navigation system, so the crew didn't really have to, keep finding out where they are all the time. It was all pre-programmed, and it worked absolutely great. Because the airplane uses special JP7 fuel, that meant we couldn't get aerial refueling from anybody except a special KC-135Q model, special tankers that were dedicated for the support of the SR-71. So these tankers were all based at Beale Air Force Base, which is the home base of the SR-71. SR-71 missions flew out of Beale, they flew out of Kadena in Okinawa, and out of Lakenheath in England. So they have all these KC-135s all around the world in order to support the SR mission. On an operational mission of high priority, the aerial refueling was so critical that at these different places where the Blackbird would have to go and refuel with a tanker, they would send 2 tankers. They would send another tanker along for insurance just in case the first tanker had a problem. So that got to be very, very expensive. To refuel, to do aerial refueling, if we're cruising at 80,000 feet, we need to drop down to about 25,000 feet to do the refueling. As we refueled, the tanker would get lighter and lighter, and we would get heavier and heavier. So as the tanker is trying to go as fast as he can, we're trying to go to stay on the boom. So we're getting heavier and heavier, and our angle of attack is getting higher and higher. So we would do a maneuver called a toboggan, which the tanker and the Blackbird would start about a 500 foot per minute descent. We could stay on the boom a little bit longer and get refueled. When the Air Force first got the airplane, they had a number of incidents with tire failures. So the Air Force procedure became that they would take off at lightweight with only about a 1/3 fuel load, take off, go straight to a tanker, take on a full load, and then accelerate on out to Mach 3. In our early days when we were testing brand new airplanes off the assembly line, we took off with a full fuel load, but of course we were operating with brand new tires, brand new wheels and everything, so it wasn't quite that risky. But after they quit making heavyweight takeoffs, a lot of their tire and wheel failures disappeared. So the crew has to wear a pressure suit in an airplane like this because as we go above about 50,000 feet, it's an Air Force regulation. For one thing, you have to have a pressure suit. And secondly, if we would have a explosive decompression at altitude of 80,000 feet, without a suit, you'd be a dead man right away. So these pressure suits, I'm sure a lot of you have experience with David Clark headsets. This pressure suit is also made by the David Clark Company. They've been making pressure suits since the early days of the Mercury space program, and they still make them today. These suits that we wore were the same as the Gemini astronauts were wearing in those years. There's a bug flying around up here. So getting suited up was quite a project. Here I am in my long underwear, and it takes two people to get you into the suit. First garment they're putting on is a sage green outfit, and that's the actual pressure vessel. That's what's holding the pressure inside your suit. And then that gets covered with the silver suit, which is worn for two reasons. One is for reflecting the heat that you might be subjected to, and the other is for solar radiation. After you get all suited up, then you wind up sitting in an easy chair over here for about an hour of pre-breathing pure oxygen. We do that in order to force the nitrogen that's in our blood, because if you get into this high altitude, low pressure environment, and if you have nitrogen bubbles in your blood, it will create a lot of problem in your joints. That's what skin divers have problem with bends. So we had to go through an hour of pre-breathing before we ever went onto the airplane. And then right here is a cooling unit. Once you put all this stuff on, you're totally sealed in. It's like wearing a plastic bag. And so we carried a cooling unit with us that pumped cool air in and kept the suit ventilated. We would get in the cockpit, get all strapped in, which you didn't strap in yourself because you had a guy on the left side and the right side who was hooking you up, hooking your hoses up, your lap belt, your shoulder harness, and everything else. And then they would take you off of this portable air conditioner unit and hooking you up to the airplane air conditioning unit. So how do we get out of this airplane with a problem? We did not have a capsule like the F-111 or the B-70 airplanes had. We had a regular ejection seat. It was much like the Lockheed F-104 ejection seat, but it was a little bit bigger and a little stronger. And our parachute was a 35-foot diameter parachute, main chute, not a 28-foot like the Air Force would be using. But when you eject, immediately a drogue chute comes out, and that stabilizes the seat, and you're still strapped in the seat. That stabilizes you, and that lets you down at an acceptable rate, down to 15,000 feet. And then, see, we're sitting on a pack that has oxygen bottles, a life raft, survival gear, and everything else. So the oxygen bottles that we're sitting on is what pressurizes our suit. So when it gets down to 15,000 feet, the drogue chute is cut away, and we have a thing called a butt snapper, which would snap us out of the seat. All of our straps, our lap belts and shoulder harness, everything would be automatically cut, and we would be pushed out of the seat, and then at that point our main parachute would open up. If you're below 15,000 feet and you eject, the drogue chute comes out also, but you also separate from the seat immediately and your main parachute would open. The airplane, this ejection seat also had the capability of getting you out of the airplane if you're sitting on the ground with 0 airspeed. It had a 0-0 seat, so if you're taxiing around the airport and you had to eject for some reason, you could do that with this seat. One of the big secrets of the airplane is the engine combination, which is one of the reasons it's able to go so fast. We have a Jace 58 engine here, which typically is a normal turbojet engine with an afterburner on the back. In front of that, we have this big spike system, big conical shaped thing, and that spike moves fore and aft 26 inches. It's sticking out as far as it will go when you're on the ground and at slow speeds. At about Mach 2, that spike starts retracting, and at Mach 3, the spike is retracted back in 26 inches. And what the spike does is maintains the shock wave at its proper position in the inlet. Now here's a couple of very complicated pictures, but here at slow speed, the spike is forward, and we have air coming in. We have a variety of vents, suck-in doors, bypass doors, and everything to manage the airflow going through here. And we are taking in subsonic air into the engine and going out, and everything is normal at that speed. But at high speed, the spike has retracted 26 inches, and the point of the spike is to maintain a shock wave in this inlet. Now, you know, you teach your students that the Bernoulli principle, that when you have air going fast over a curved surface, it's going to accelerate the air and it's going to drop the pressure, and that's how the wing develops lift. At supersonic flow, that's all backwards. If you accelerate the air supersonically, the pressure rises dramatically. So we take that pressure and use it to our advantage. So we're able to take that high pressure in the inlet, and we can bypass the engine compressor for the most part and run some of that air around the outside of the engine for cooling, and some of it goes through these big 6 tubes that are on the engine, which bypass that high pressure air back around the back. It passes the compressor section, passes the burner section, passes the turbines, and injects it right into the back of the airplane, back of the afterburner area where it's mixed with fuel. You know, if you take a child's little rubber balloon and you blow it up and you let it go, of course it goes, it immediately takes off, you know. Well, that's what we do with this high pressure in this airplane. That balloon has a 1.5 to 1 compression ratio, not a whole lot to expand that balloon. The compression ratio we have in the inlet here is 40 to 1. So we have a tremendous amount of high pressure there to work with. Here's a little different picture of that inlet. We have shock waves that appear here in the inlet. Those are called oblique shock waves, and then they wind up with what's called a terminal or a normal shock wave. That is the point at which the air finally slows down to subsonic speeds, because the engine cannot accept supersonic air. It has to be slowed down to subsonic speeds. So we wind up with a bunch of pressure in here that is tremendous, and we use that to our advantage. You know, there's 4 cycles of an engine that you always think about. There's the suck, squeeze, the blow, and the burn. I've got that backwards. Suck, squeeze, burn, and blow. Well, we don't need the first 2 stages. is add some fuel to it, burn it, blow it out the back, and that's our thrust. So we do this with this inlet, does this by managing the air and the shock waves in the inlet. So what that means is that if we're going in the area of Mach 3, the inlet is giving us 54% of our thrust. The engine is only good at about 17%. It's not doing much for us. And the ejector back on the back, the nozzle on the back, is modulated to optimize the flow of air coming out the back to give us the greatest amount of thrust. So what that gives us is that maximum range is at maximum speed. The faster we go, the better miles per gallon we get. In any vehicle you've ever operated, if you're running low on fuel, what do? You pull the power back to save fuel, right? In this airplane, you push the power up. You do just the opposite from what you might do. So it's the only machine in the world that does that. Now, you have to be already at Mach 3. But if you're way out over the Pacific or something and you're running low on fuel, you push it up, go as fast as you can, and you'll get the best miles per gallon. On our flight test routines, we assembled all the airplanes at Palmdale Air Force Plant 42, and we would take off and climb up in the Edwards Air Force Base restricted area, where ATC would give us a clearance to above flight level 600. And then we could go anywhere we want because we had a special call sign. We had a Dutch call sign, or Dutch 54, Dutch 57, numbers like that. And so ATC knew that if you got a call from a Dutch airplane, you gave them whatever you wanted. So we would fly across northern Arizona and New Mexico, do a right 180. We would pass down over southern New Mexico, over Holloman Air Force Base, the White Sands Missile Range, where we did some classified testing with them. And then we headed on back. We went back and landed at Palmdale. That's about a 1-hour flight. Go all the way to Texas and back in 1 hour. We often let down and did an aerial refueling here at Beatty, Nevada, on the California-Nevada border. We would drop down to 25,000 feet, take on a full load of fuel, then accelerate back up to Mach 3, go up, circle around Mount Rainier, come down the west coast of the U.S. and come back and land at Palmdale. That was a 2.5-hour flight. Now we're covering a lot of real estate in a flight like that. That's what makes you want to get the supersonic transport for airline travel. So if you're up at that high altitude, if we're up here, right here at Midway, we could look back here and see Mount Rainier, snow-capped peak at Mount Rainier, and you could look down here and you could see the starting of Baja California. The really impressive thing to me was in flying the airplane, the great amount of real estate you would travel. You would, we're flying over St. Louis area in a jet airliner. The ground moves by at a certain perception rate, whatever. You don't really feel like you're going 450 miles an hour. You have the same perception here at 85,000 feet. The ground isn't whizzing by any faster, but you realize you're covering a lot of real estate. Arizona takes a little while, New Mexico takes a little while. If you go all the way across Texas, it takes longer because Texas is a little bit bigger. But the impressive thing to me was how far you can see and how much you're covering over the earth. So we're traveling 85,000 feet is usually the highest we went, and 2,300 miles an hour. So each of those engines had the power of the Queen Mary. So if you got here on I-70 and you get in your car and you drive your car for an hour westbound, in about an hour, where are you going to be? Out around Warrenton or Wright City or somewhere like that. If you're in your Cessna trainer and you're heading the same route. Where you're going to be in an hour? You're going to be in Colombia. In an SR-71, same route. Where you're going to be in 1 hour? You're going to be in Juneau, Alaska. That's how much. That's how fast it goes. If you're over St. Louis and ATC says, and you're heading over St. Louis, you're heading north. ATC says turn left to 180. So you roll into a turn, you make a same 3 degree per second turn like you normally do. When you roll out on a 180 heading, where you're going to be? You're going to be almost to Kansas City. So it takes the same amount of time to turn around, but you cover an awful lot of land. So a little trivia is, in 1958, they didn't have computers. A lot of this airplane was designed with slide rules. I gave a talk to Boeing here a couple years ago, a bunch of Boeing engineers. I gave them the same talk. And, I asked them, how many of you have even used slide rules or know how to use slide rules? And, just a smattering of people raise their hands because they do everything on a computer today. So in later years, they knew this, and so they ran a lot of the computations that they'd done with slide rules. They ran them on modern computers, and they found out that they got the same results. These guys were doing with slide rules as good as they can do today with modern computers. So in all the flying they've done, they've had over 1,000 SAM missiles fired at it. They know that because they're taking pictures all the time, so they have a lot of pictures of SAM missiles trying desperately to catch up with them, but they don't, and they run out of fuel and they fail. And they've got one picture that has 2 MiG fighters trying to get together and shoot the airplane down, and they have a mid-air collision and they both crash. So this airplane has held the speed and altitude record for a long time. I think it's about 40 years now. And this altitude record is a record for a manned airplane taking off, flying level at this altitude, and then coming down and landing it. There's higher altitude records in which they zoom the airplane, but this is a sustained altitude record. So they flew well over 3,000 missions all over the world. There's a lot of flight data that has been gathered with this airplane that's probably still in the depths of the CIA records, and I'm not sure we'll ever know, but there's a lot of unmentionable areas that the airplane has flown over. And because the airplane gets heat treated every flight, it becomes stronger in every flight. So every time it flies, all that titanium on the airplane is a little bit heavier than it was before. So what's the view at 80,000 feet? Well, as you can see, the sky is very dark. You can see some stars up there. Not a whole lot of them, like on a clear night, but you can pick out stars. And I would point out that down here on the ground, this is daylight. This is the middle of the day, and the sun is shining down there and everything else, but this is what it looks like to us. And there's a slight curvature. You sort of have to imagine it a little bit. It's not like an astronaut would see, but it is pretty impressive. So here's one of my favorite pictures of the airplane. At Lockheed, we thought we were going to get the SST program, and we didn't. All of us thought we were going to wind up on the SST and have that job for the rest of our lives, but we didn't. I wound up getting an offer from TWA that I couldn't turn down, so I went to work for them. And at age 60, which was about 22 years ago, the FAA, with an act of age discrimination, dragged me out kicking and screaming. Said I was not safe enough to be an airline pilot anymore, but I was just getting good. I could just finally land a 767 really well. So then 50 years later, I got into air racing. This is not my race plane, but it's one just like mine. So I used to fly at Mach 3.2, and now I'm down to flying at 0.3 Mach, so it's been quite a slow up. But I've had quite a ride. I've really enjoyed aviation. Nothing has been closer to my heart as my flights in the Blackbird and my chance to be just a very small part of that amazing program. So that's it. Thank you very much.